Cool. Oh, look. Is it on? Yeah? Everyone hear me okay? Cool. Yeah, welcome to FMX 5. I'm really excited to be here. Thanks so much to Maxon for having me and for FMX for having me as well. So obviously, got the power of two suns on me now. Yeah, so obviously my name is Amy Ash. A little bit about me. I'm a character artist, supervisor, and viz dev sculptor. I was the head of characters at Axis Studios up until last year. Working in illustration animation for about well, it says 23 years here, but it's actually more like 25 now, so I'm a bit of a dinosaur. I was previously a generalist with a focus on character concepting, modeling, and animation. And then about 7 or 8 years ago, I decided to focus on characters because that was the thing that appealed to me the most. Now working as a character visual development artist with Netflix Animation, and I can say precisely nothing about the work I'm doing there, unfortunately. So I've got a little show reel just to kind of introduce myself, you know, the kind of work I did. Most of this work is work that I worked directly on at Axis, so I tend not to kind of put work on that. Because I was head of characters, I did kind of touch every single project in some way, but this is the work that I was actually directly hands-on on. So I'll play that now. So, thank you. So this is where I started out. This is a slightly bonkers town called Blackpool in the north of England. I grew up by the sea. We have our own Eiffel Tower, but we could only afford to build like the last little bit of it. So it's a very crazy place. You can't see in this picture up on the top left here. There's actually a building with a skull on it in there somewhere, which is where I spent a lot of my youth and arcade there. And I went to this place called Blackpool College, which was just down the road from where I lived. These bits of work here are some of the only surviving bits I have left from that course. Everything else got lost. The course is called Scientific and Natural History Illustration, which there is not a lot of demand for nowadays, as you can imagine. So I kind of made the decision quite quickly to pivot to working digitally because the course was in watercolors and things like that. And the little dinosaur there on the CD was the first freelance job I ever did whilst I was still at college. It was for a calendar of some sort. I did all that in Photoshop. I can't get those files off there anymore because it's like an original Mac disk, so I don't have even the operating system to open it anymore. Then went on to become like I say, a generalist, doing lots of different things, advertising, some games work, some things for illustrations for museums, things like that, anything that came along really. And then I kind of branched out into animation a little bit, and on top of doing modeling for this show, this was a show called Roy the Racing Car with Cosgrove Hall, and we did the CG crash scenes, and it was all stop motion, and we did all the CG crash scenes. So I modeled a lot of this show, and I animated quite a lot of the show as well. And this was the first time I ever used ZBrush. Those trees were the first thing I ever did in ZBrush, and it was a game changer for me because I was using like polygons for everything, and then this thing came along, and suddenly we could use this thing called displacement, and it was incredible. That was really important actually for matching the style of these like handcrafted little props that Cosgrove were making. Carried on, being generalist, but you can see characters starting to kind of come to the fore. At this point, by this stage, I was still animating, I was doing concept artwork as well. But really, characters were kind of like the thing that I really wanted to do. And so after a while, I quit a very stable job to go freelance and start doing character work. Axis was kind of like something a studio that I looked up to for a long time, especially after things like the Alien Isolation trailer that they did. So eventually I did end up at Axis in about 2018, I think. I started at the beginning of 2018. As you can see, pretty varied list of clients and style of work that we did. Lots and lots of different styles, lots of different clients. Blizzard, Riot, Wizards of the Coast were very high amongst us, and obviously Netflix with Love, Death and Robots and Secret Level. And we did actually work on Love, Death and Robots Season 4, which is coming out soon, on an episode called The Screaming of the Tyrannosaur. We didn't quite manage to finish it, but Blur very kindly finished it for us. Obviously, this is one of the shows that I worked on. I was lead character artist on the Tallgrass in Season 2 of Love, Death and Robots. And this is where we started bringing in this idea of concept sculpting. So we were working with, at the time, working with a guy called James W. Kane, who is an incredible artist. I really urge you to check out his work. I think he's on Cara now. He left ArtStation. But his work is on Cara, but he's an incredible artist. Really nice guy as well. And he was doing all these, I was working quite closely with him, myself and him, doing lots of different sculpts of the main character, trying to figure out the look of him. And eventually, we ended up here with that character after going through lots of different variations. Around the same time, I started doing lots of faster sculpts myself at home. Things like this. After seeing the lighthouse, I just kind of came home and spent a couple of hours looking at Robert Pattinson's face and thinking, yeah, I really want to sculpt that. And so I came home and made like this kind of very much in the trying to get into the feeling of Love, Death and Robots and things like that. To try and push my skills a little bit. And then progressing on to lots of speed sculpts in my spare time, just trying to do as many as I could. Heads were an area I was a little bit weak on, so I was trying to focus on that, really, improve my head modeling skills. So some of these are, from reference, some of these are, like real people, and then some are, some are obviously made up. If anyone watches the show Black Sails, you probably recognize a couple of people here. And then we started to bring that back into, more into the work we were doing at Axis as well. If anyone is aware of a little game called Magic the Gathering, we did a lot of work with Wizards of the Coast for a lot of their trailers. And this was Ajani. It was the first time he was going to be seen in 3D in anything in a trailer. So obviously Wizards are very protective of him because he's one of their main characters. And we made a decision quite early on to do like a fast concept sculpt, up front and try and get ahead of it so we could get sign off from a client, rather than kind of going through the normal production process of, spending a week on something and then them coming back and saying it's not right, and then suddenly we're panicking because we're running out of days and rigging's already started and things like that. So I did this concept sculpt for this. This is about a day's work, to get this sculpt out. The idea is to kind of work fast and then, get feedback fast. And then if anything, if it's going off in the wrong direction, we've not wasted that much time. We've not got too precious about anything, and we can change course quite quickly. And that was a turn that we sent to the client, and this got signed off pretty quickly as how we wanted him to look. And then in the final trailer, which is a couple of shots from a trailer that we did with him in, we had this amazing mocap actor called Ace Rule, who does a lot of stuff on stilts and things, and he was doing a mocap for him. It was really fun. So for this talk, I wanted to do something a little bit different, because my work nowadays is very much what I'm trying to do in my characters, and the idea is trying to do the sculpt quickly, not getting too precious about anything. But the core of it is storytelling, always. The story of the character and the feeling of the character. And so that's kind of my day-to-day is just kind of getting through these characters, trying to explore different ways that we can communicate something about that character. For this particular talk, I wanted to do a new piece. So I was very obsessed slightly with this book called Wild by an author called Amy Jeffs. And there's a short story in there called The Lament of Hoss. And it's based on a very, very old text. It's a retelling of a very old text. And it's about a woman who is tricked by her lover and taken out to a secluded grove and murdered and buried in a barrow with these kind of ghosts of old kings, all these kind of and things like that. And it sounds grim, but it's the kind of thing I like for some reason. So I'm very much into old folk tales and things like that. So I wanted to do something along those lines. So I started kind of building up reference to the kind of thing I wanted to do. Very, very much a fan of old Arthur Rackham, Albrecht Dürer, and things like that. And then some images that we've got here as well. Gustav Doré, of course, on the bottom left there as well. And this was the reference file that kind of built up over the course of the entire thing. So it was quite a lot to, a lot that I was kind of covering there. And like I say, this was built up over the course of the entire project. Just going to switch quickly to iPad now, because this whole thing started on iPad. Obviously, for a lot of my work, I work on desktop. But the great thing about the iPad is when you've got this idea, now that you've got ZBrush for iPad, you've got an idea of what you want to do, is even if you just sat in front of a tally or anything like that, you can start kind of sketching away and working on things. Thing to note is, no matter what I'm doing, I always start with a sphere. And the reason why I always start with a sphere is just because if I start with a base mesh, I spend as much time trying to get rid of the features of that base mesh as I am actually creating something new. The bulk of my work, I'm using clay buildup. It's my favorite brush by far, just for kind of building up shapes. So every time I'm starting ahead, then main thing that I'm doing is just kind of pulling shapes out, starting to kind of work on things and build into it. And then for actual things like clothing or anything like that, one technique I do use a huge amount is kind of masking and extracting. So just take this down slightly. So literally, you can mask something out like this. And then extract that, and then use polygroups to clean it up. And I'll show that process a little bit, and in the videos, I'll go through it quickly now. So obviously, you've got all of your palettes. Pretty much everything that you have in the desktop version is in the iPad version, so it's great. So we can extract here, set your thickness and things like that. Just click accept. And then obviously, this looks pretty messy. If going to solo mode here, it is a bit of a mess, but it's polygrouped already. So if I turn on this, and you'll see the edges are a different group. So we can clear that mask. And then, sorry, cease doing. And then what I'll normally do is hide various edges. And then we can regroup that basically, just by coming back into our palettes, going down to polygroups, and then we can do auto groups, and it will regroup that edge. And as soon as I come back into here and undo all of this, and if we go to deformation, we can actually ZRemesh this first if we want to, but I'll just show it quickly in deformation. So we've got this third feature called polish by groups. If we set it to the second one here, and then scale this up, and you'll see it'll polish it, but wherever we have a change in the poly group, you get this nice sharp edge, and it's a really good way of just getting nice clean extractions from things. So I can do as messy a sculpt as I want, as messy a mask as I want, and then just extract that and keep working on it and get really nice clean shapes from that. I'll switch back to the computer, and then I can show some videos of the process work. So let me close this down for a second. So I have some videos. Obviously, they are a little bit fast, but this is kind of the general process. Started out with the female character for a start. So this is me again, starting from a sphere, just kind of just trying to block out the shapes. Get the primary forms in first, and then kind of move on to other things. I have a bit of a weakness in my sculpting, is that everything looks bad until suddenly it doesn't. So often when I'm sculpting, things look quite bad, and then all of a sudden at some point it'll start to look like something. But you see some people online who can kind of sculpt and it looks brilliant from the start. You can kind of see what it's going to be from the start. I'm not really necessarily like that. But that's kind of something that I do want to talk about in this talk, really, is that my work is very much, I will go in a particular direction and it's not working. And I have to go back and try something new and go back in a different direction. And, it's not linear, because the point is I don't have a design I'm working from. I'm designing as I'm sculpting. So I will sometimes try things and then it won't work out. Just using curve tubes here to create some rough hair. You can obviously use curve alpha, to get something, and you can change the thickness of it along the curve and things like that. I tend to always start with a tube and then just sculpt it out, just because a lot of my work is really sculpting. Like I say, for most of the things that I do, I use quite a limited bunch of brushes, so clay build-up, down standard, move brush, H polish, things like that. And then obviously just extracting clothing. Everything's starting off from basic shapes that I'm building out and then just extracting from. So a lot of masking and extracting, and then just kind of like blocking this in. And the idea is here, I'm just building up towards getting a block out of the whole image. So I just want to kind of get everything in roughly, so I know roughly what I'm doing. And I did some variations on the face, because she's supposed to be dead, so I was trying to do some different variations and stuff like that. And then I moved on to the king. So this is still on my iPad, and I stuck with that same model that I'd already done for Hoss. So this is going to be the king character. So he's going to be very dead. He's he's going to be a lot more bony, a lot older, a lot more kind of sinister. So I'm really trying to get the anatomy in there. Really trying to look at the forms of the skull and muscles and things like that. I got as much reference as I could just to try and build up that reference, and then starting to block out some of the armor here. So he's got this helmet on, and again you can see it's just a sphere. I'm just dragging it down and then masking, removing things like these side plates here, and you can see I'm just using that same thing of just masking corners and then smoothing by groups. It is very fast on the iPad, the movie recording. I'm aware of that, so it's quite quick the way that it shows it here. But you can see how rough I'm being at this point, and I'm not being precious about anything. And like these shapes here, I'm just kind of like exploring different shapes and things and seeing what works. Decided he had to have a crown, because he's a king, so I gave him a crown. And again, they're really, really rough shapes, and not worrying too much about details or anything like that. I'm just trying to get a feeling for, for what it is I'm making. Obviously, he needs a goatee, so he gets a very bad goatee. And again, this is super rough, but the idea is that when I'm sculpting normally, is that I'm trying to get to a point where I can send it to the client and say, this is the general idea that I'm headed towards. Are we in a good place? And then and of course, proof that I worked on the iPad on this and that I can insert a picture of my dog into any talk that I do. I need no excuse at all. Yeah, I'm continuing just to block out here, and you can see there I was just starting with primitives for the body, spheres, cylinders, and then just dynameshing them together. Dynamesh is a tool I use a lot, just building things up from primitive shapes and then bringing it all together. Yeah, I gave him a cross at this point. I took it out in the end, just because it wasn't actually going to be visible in the final thing, but also just because of time restrictions as well, because crosses in most days are quite ornate, and I just didn't have time to work on it. So then, I could take these characters, I can pose them. I'm back in the desktop version here. I've taken everything from the iPad onto the desktop and pose them. And the idea of this image is that they're going to be kind of like buried underground in the story. They're kind of surrounded by roots, and and by these tree roots. There's a huge oak tree on top that's kind of grown down into the ground, and that's holding them in place. So I'm getting some idea of those shapes there, and that's kind of like, yeah, a rough block out of the image that I had at that point. And it was enough to kind of move forwards and figure out what I'm doing. And like I say, I could send that to a client and get a clear idea about what I'm doing. Give them a clear idea about the kind of work that I'm doing. Then obviously, I can continue cleaning up. And again, this is exactly that same process. I'm just masking, repolygrouping the edges, and Z-remeshing, and then using that polish by groups just to refine those groups there. The edge, there's a trim here that was a little bit different, because obviously I wanted a little bit more detail in this. I wanted like a lip coming out. So I Z-remeshed this. I'm just going to pause it there. So I've Z-remeshed this down a little bit and made sure that the topology is doing what I want to do. And then I can basically use Z-modeler to give it new polygroups, and then extrude that polygroup where I want those extrusions to be. So really simple stuff. I'm just building up detail, basically, as I'm going. Now this is quite, I left this thing because it's quite interesting, because I started making this like little kind of animal kind of motif thing here. I'm just going to pause it briefly. And this is what can happen if you just start, obviously it's not a very polished sculpt, but I was just getting into detail a little bit too quickly because I was getting carried away because I want to do a cute little animal. And this just ended up just being too much, even just from this, as I was trying to kind of get more into it, I just kind of felt that this was too much. So I ended up simplifying quite a bit. But it does show that if you get caught up on one area too much, it's really the worst thing you can do at this point. I think it's best to kind of keep on moving and keep, trying to build everything up gradually rather than focus on one thing at a time. Boolean as well, live Boolean. Hugely useful tool in ZBrush. And here I'm just, again, starting with primitives and then just using the live Boolean. This is for a hinge. So I'm just using live Boolean just to take away the bits that I don't need. Really simple hinge, nothing fancy about it. Very, simple to model, just using that live Boolean, and then putting in, some pins and some bolts there, just to give it some more detail. And then using deformers and things, to put it in place. A little bit of Z-modeler there, just to kind of take out that area, and then using the deformers, just to kind of move it into place. And a lot of my work is this, just masking, extracting, adding detail, just like building it up gradually as I'm going. And you'll see me moving around a lot just because I'm looking at it. I'm trying to figure out what's happening. And then Z-modeler is something I'm not as comfortable in Z-modeler as I am, say, like polymodeling in Maya. But the addition of it, when it came into ZBrush, meant that I could spend more time in ZBrush. I didn't have to go out of ZBrush into something else, to kind of create small details. So there's plenty of things that I will use ZModeler for. Now this is interesting because it's difficult to know what it is I'm modeling here until you see it. But this is one of those things where in ZBrush there's so many different ways of doing things all the time. There's different techniques and different ways that you can do things. It's the same in a lot of 3D. There's so many different routes through to doing different things. And sometimes you have to think about how it's going to be easiest to model something. So this is actually going to be his crown. And if I try and model this, in the actual shape that it's going to be in a circular shape, it's going to be harder for me. So I decided to model it flat, and then I can bend it into place afterwards. Using bend, I have a bend curve here, which is an amazing tool in ZBrush. I use it a huge amount. If I have time, I'll show it a little bit on my iPad afterwards, but it's really, really good tool just for kind of doing anything like straps and things like that, or cords and things, and being able to kind of like pose it really quickly into place. Obviously, you can use curve tubes as well. That's great, but I really do like the bend curve tool in deformers. And then you can see I'm just curving that round using bend arc to make a full crown. I dynameshed it to get rid of the joint at the back, and then soft deformer just to kind of get it into place. And then just continuing to build up shapes, things like just little details around here, and it's just really basic sculpting, just masking, extracting, and pretty basic sculpting with a bit of H polish there to kind of make up some shapes. And I'm still trying things, I'm still designing things as I go. There's quite a lot of video that I had to cut from this, and if I could show you all, I would do. But there's plenty that I did here, that I modeled like quite ornate pieces that I modeled very quickly. And I put it on here, and it just wasn't working. And I just kind of got to a point where it's just like, this doesn't look right. It doesn't fit anywhere, so I threw it away. And that's the whole point. It's not getting too precious about your work, so that then if you do have to change, then you can. Moving on to the clothing, and again, we're extracting. And this is an example of something that didn't work. I really wanted these kind of circular shapes around his head, so that we're kind of framing his head a little bit, so drawing attention to his head. So I started working on something, and it just wasn't quite going where I wanted it to, and I kind of got to this point, and I thought, I don't like it. I can't really explain why. I just didn't like it. I still wanted the circular thing, but it was just this idea of these kind of like big bordered shapes that I didn't like. So I ended up thinking about these smaller pieces of leather in kind of circular shapes and going with that instead. And again, there's nothing fancy about this. I'm just using the polygroups to clean up these shapes, just masking, extracting, using polygroups to clean up the shapes. A little word on cloth modeling. So if you want to work in character art, obviously you've got tools like Marvelous Designer and things like that. But in my line of work, where I have maximum sometimes like 5 days to do a character. I don't have time to take it out of ZBrush and then kind of go back into a different program, set up do all the setup for Marvelous and things like that. So learning how to sculpt cloth is really, really important, I think. Even if you do use an external program, to simulate your cloth and then bring it back into ZBrush, knowing what makes good cloth will help you in the other software, and it will also mean that you can make edits a lot quicker. So obviously, a lot of cloth, you can build up with these zigzag shapes, but as you get more confident with it, as you practice it more, you'll find ways to break that and make more interesting cloth. You will see quite a lot of characters that have just very standard zigzag shapes, in pretty much everywhere that you want. I'm just going to pause this a minute and go back because I'm still talking about cloth. But you want to start kind of like incorporating those into bigger shapes. So you've got some of these, pipe folds and things like that, tension points, all those kind of things. There's lots of good videos on YouTube on different types of cloth folds, and it's really worth kind of looking into those. Obviously, think about the kind of cloth that you're modeling as well. In this case, it's a slightly heavier wool, so I don't want to do anything too sharp and too fine. So I'll skip forward to everything. And then more details like this, obviously extracting this out, but then just using curves to insert a rope here. I can probably show you quickly if ZBrush will load. It might not be. I won't do that actually because I don't think it will be authorized just on this machine just right now. But there we go. It's going to load anyway. So if we start with something like, yeah, we can just start with this, it's fine. Make it a polymesh 3D. And then any shape that you have, if you have an open border, so if we get rid of this bottom edge here, and we can go geometry, modify topology, and delete hidden. So we've got this open mesh here. We can go up to stroke. And if we come to curve functions, there's a function called frame mesh, which will give you a curve along. You can select either the mesh border, a polygroup, anything like that, and add a curve around it. And then if you have a tool like curve tubes, then you can just click on it, and it will create a tube around there. Really useful for adding in details, like that rope, and that's exactly how I did that on the rope there. Need a little bit of cleanup because for some reason it was doubling up, so I just did that just with polygroups. Yeah, and then just more cloth work. I spend a lot of time doing cloth, stylized cloth, realistic cloth, all sorts. It's a huge chunk of my work, especially in the work I'm doing at the moment. I think I've sculpted about 200 cloaks or something like that recently. So yeah, there's been a lot of that kind of stuff. And again, small details like this. All I'm doing is extracting and then and cleaning up and then sculpting into it. And I'm just using like brushes like clay buildup, dam standard here, just really basic things. But as long as you understand the construction of something and understand what you're trying to achieve with it, then you're in a good place. A little bit of Z modeler here because we're going to start modeling this brooch that's going to hold this cloak in place. I tried a lot of different alphas here, and I have no problem with using alphas when I need to, and I need to add detail quickly. But it's all about making sure that you're adding the right detail. And that first one was just too busy for what I wanted, so I ended up going with this simpler one, and that I was happy with that because if it was too detailed, it was just going to look like noise. Once I got it into the image, it was just going to look like noise. So I did try to go for something simpler. I did drag an alpha across it there. You'll see just to kind of get some texture in there because I wanted it to look old. But the thing to think about alphas is try not to use them indiscriminately. It's very easy. You'll see a lot of sculpts where people just drag lots and lots of alphas over things. It really flattens out the work. And sometimes the forms underneath aren't good, and you just keep on adding detail to things with alphas, and it doesn't look great. What I did here actually was I recorded a morph target before I started adding any detail onto this. You can do it onto a layer as well. And then you can, if you put the detail on, you can take it away afterwards if you want to. So you'll see from this version to this version, there's a lot less of that alpha breakup because I've taken it away in quite a few areas, and then start working into it. It's the same with everything. You do still want to have that kind of human touch to it. You work into things yourself and things like that rather than just relying on alphas all the time, because it's very easy to kind of get into that habit, I think, especially when you're up against it time-wise. Yeah, and then just placing those. Curve with a insert mesh brush for the chains. Again, I do spend time, I'll go into ArtStation onto the store and just look for the thing that I need and then use it. It's there's no when you're up against it deadline-wise, you use whatever you can to get the work done. And then a little bit of radial symmetry, just working on this little button here. This was going to go on to the trim of his cloak. I did so many different things to this. I tried very ornate pieces, and again, it was just too much detail. It was just too heavy. So I ended up going with this, smaller, simpler button, and then created an insert mesh brush from that, and then I can just put it in place for wherever I wanted it to be. Now, this is a good way of adding more detail. Obviously, when you go into the surface tool, So if we come back into ZBrush, you have a surface down here. Sorry. Then obviously you open up the noise thing and you can load in an alpha. So if you double click on here, it will load in an alpha. I don't have an alpha, just load in here, but you can load an alpha and apply that as a noise. And that's what I was doing here. But if we come back and look here, I did a quick, I used a UV master to quickly unwrap this. Just quickly Z-remeshed it, reprojected it, used UV master to unwrap this, so I had some UVs on it. But obviously, it put a seam exactly where I didn't want it to be, right down the front, right through the middle of a visible part of my sculpt. So we can just use the painting tools in the UV master to protect some areas and then paint with blue to attract the seams to other areas. So in the red areas, it's going to be no seams. In blue areas, we're going to have it's going to attract the seams. Then you can see it protected all of that area there. And then I can project this this texture on. So this kind of like weave texture here on there. That's just using that surface tool. Loading is an alpha. You can change the size of it and things like that, and then just projected it on. I ended up adding it on a couple more times, just to kind of like really bulk it out. And then again, just a little bit of sculpting, just to kind of like sit it in place. Just quickly go to the next video. Back to the head, and this is the fun bit. So organic stuff is always more fun. I always like doing organic stuff, especially something like this, a little bit more fantasy, a little bit more kind of like grungy and stuff. And it kind of looks like I'm just kind of feathering around this a lot, just like doing little bits here and there. But I really like to spend my time moving across the model. I never focus on one area for too long. I'm always kind of like going all around the model, trying to build it all up as one. I want to have control of the forms always, just making sure that all the forms down there are ones that I intended, rather than ending up with very kind of loose, blobby forms or anything like that. So I really do spend quite a bit of time just kind of building all this up gradually. And this is all just clay build-up. I like the texture it gives, and it gives like a nice sharp edge when I want it to as well. And you can do a lot of very kind of like soft crisscross strokes to kind of build up forms. And I'm just trying to, explore this a little bit, explore where I'm going to kind of get interesting shapes from. And keep working through that. I'll skip ahead a little bit. Started to put in his beard. So again, we were just starting with clay tubes there. Just dragging out those, sorry, not clay tubes, curved tubes there. A curved tubes brush, and you can see me adding some there with curved tubes. And just dragging them out and then starting to kind of work into it. Hair is really difficult, It's really difficult to get hair that looks good and looks interesting. And I spend a lot of time just kind of moving and pushing and pulling and stretching and trying to get a feeling of gravity to them. And again, it's one of those things, as a character artist, you end up having to be, you need to know anatomy, you need to know tailoring and clothing and things like that, and then you need to know about hairstyles and how hair works and how it sits and things like that. So there's a lot of different things that go into it, and I spend quite a lot of time just kind of moving these different strands around and trying to find little shapes that I like, little interactions between strands that I like. And then a bit of sculpting just to break up those shapes, because it is a more realistic sculpt. This, it's if I was doing something more stylized, I would leave it a little bit simpler. But this is a little bit more realistic, so I just want to, break up those shapes a little bit and get a little bit more form into there. Yeah, and then more work onto the head. Now that I've got the beard in, I know some areas that I don't need to spend too much time on. Really important thing is, work on what's going to end up on screen. We had a particular point at Axis, I remember, where we previewed these characters and we previewed them. I kind of came onto this project and we were previewing these characters close up on the head, rotating around the head, and these characters in the final cinematic, which was for Halo, they're in the dark, in the background, looking away from camera. And you can't see any of it. And there were so many comments generated by us presenting something that wasn't ever going to be seen. So I'm a big fan of knowing what it is that you are putting on screen. and understanding that and you know, putting your time where it's needed rather than anywhere else. Just keep on, you know, I'm obviously just keeping up building up the detail again. Again, using alphas here a little bit. You know, for metal, alphas are really good because you can get really nice sharp scratches with, you know, with alphas, with metal. So I'm just dragging them out, but it's just always trying to use it in a very artistic way. You know, don't just drag them out indiscriminately. Try and think about what it is that you're doing. You know, it's quite difficult to see here because I'm adding very, very subtle detail and building it up gradually, rather than just dragging out, you know, one big alpha and leaving it at that. I'm making decisions all the time. And that's what you should be doing, is always just like making decisions where you're placing that detail and where you want, you know, the detail to be, rather than just letting the alpha decide that for you. Sometimes you'll get a texture or an alpha that just works perfectly and does what you want it to, but it's quite rare. So I do like to kind of, you know, still continue to kind of build up that time, and using H polish just to you know, add little bits of damages and edges and things like that. You know, more dense and things like that in his helmet, because he's an elderly gentleman by this point, so it stands to reason his helmet is too. This is really cool, actually. So in ZBrush, you can take any alpha and make a 3D mesh of it quite simply, and it's a really good way of kind of, you know, getting more complex shapes. It's just any alpha you have. So if we come into here, we just cancel this. Let's come into a brush we can use with an alpha. And select this guy here, and we can come to alpha, make 3D. You can set a resolution for it. So I'm going to put into a 4:8, so we've got a decent amount of resolution, and click make 3D. It will take a moment, probably a bit slower than on my desktop at home, but it will basically generate a 3D object for you. And that's what I had here basically, is an alpha, you know, turned into a 3D object. And the reason why I'm using this instead of just dragging an alpha out for the detail is that now it's an object, I have access to deformers. So if this alpha doesn't exactly match the shape I want it to, which it didn't, I can move it into place. I can use deformers to, you know, like the bend curve here, then soft deform here, and the deformers to kind of, you know, move it into place. And it just means that you've got a lot more versatility over what you're doing there. So I could you know, create these details and then drop them in. And then when I was ready, I can group that all together, dynamesh it, you know, so that we don't get those kind of like hard edges. So I can soften off some of the intersections and things like that, and then just keep working into it, you know, just to add some detail on there. And then just a little bit of, you know, beating him up a little bit more damage, things like that. And yeah, that's kind of like, you know, the asset for the king and where he ended up at. So obviously then back to, there you go, there's my 3D model from the alpha. I always had to go back to Horse itself. I was back on my iPad here, so I was watching The Thing whilst modeling this. It was a nice evening. Every now and again, the dog would walk over my iPad and ruin things. Yeah, just focusing on that cloth again and just trying to get more interesting shapes. I decided I wanted an expression on her face as well. She doesn't have teeth here, so she looks a little bit odd. But I'm still working on that expression. I wanted to look a little bit scared, a little bit worried. You know, in this point in the story, she's waking up and she doesn't quite understand what's happened to her. And the king behind her is telling her that everyone has abandoned her and left her on her own. So it's quite an emotional point in the storyline for her. The other point of her story is that she was, and you know, it makes clear reference to it in the story. She was murdered by a blow to the back of the head with a sword, and it cuts her hair as it hits her, and leaves an injury in the back of her head. So I wanted to have that in the storytelling, not like super obvious, because obviously I didn't want to kind of, you know, looking away from camera and pointing at this injury, but I did want to include it in the image. Again, more hair, just trying to find those shapes. Try and add twist to hair as well. I always try and add a little bit of a twist to hair strands as I'm going. and then just adding detail with things like, the adornments that she has around her chest there and things like that. And then we needed to get it into the full scene. So you can start posing this, take it back into the desktop version and start posing her. It makes a terrible mess of a neck, but I can fix that later on. It is important to kind of think if you're going to go into a pose, like not spending too much time on certain areas that are just going to get, changed when you pose it and things like that. So you just have to keep an eye on that kind of thing. So you can see there I'm kind of like sculpting that neck up again, just making sure that the anatomy is good in the neck area and starting to add that injury in the back of the neck. The head looks a bit weird without the hair, but it's fine with the hair. And then just continuing sculpting on the cloth there and trying to get a little bit more interest and detail in all of this. From here, I started kind of like, again, all of these branches, all these roots, were just done with clay tubes. Sorry, I keep on saying clay tubes, curved tubes, and then just dynameshing them all together at a low resolution, so I could just like smooth out areas that I wanted to. And then just using clay buildup, just to find shapes in and find these kind of like gnarly roots and interesting shapes. This was so much fun. Honestly, like modeling roots, if you just want to do like a nice modeling exercise for a day, like modeling a tree or roots, it was a huge amount of fun. So I was just like trying to find really interesting shapes here, anything that kind of like added a little bit of drama to things. Really fast sculpting, really just like, laying down shapes quickly, not getting too precious about anything. Very much like kind of looking at, the way that Arthur Rackham did his trees and things like that. And then again, I'm just using curved tubes just to add some extra branches down at the bottom here. I didn't want to do too many everywhere because it would, again, want to avoid that kind of busyness, but I'm just adding some more in and then using Dynamesh to combine them to the main root so I can smooth out those intersections. So what we ended up with, I'll go back to my presentation. So what we ended up with was this. This was the image that I had after all of that. And I'd done all this work and I kind of looked at it and I went, nah, it's all right. Don't like it that much. There was things in it I liked and stuff like that, and I could see it was getting somewhere, but it wasn't there quite yet. So I thought, it's fine, I'll go and look on ArtStation for some inspiration. That was not a great idea, But then I think, a really good piece of advice is go away and do something different for a little bit. Have a think about it, come back to it. I live in Scotland. I'm very lucky, so I get to go to places like this and take my camera with me and things like that. And just spend a bit of time away from the screen. I'm still thinking about it. I'm still kind of like sat there thinking, but by the time I finish doing a walk or whatever, I'm ready to go back to it. I'm kind of like, I'm really enthusiastic and I'm ready to go back to it. Just spending time with, doing other things. I told you I could get my dog into it as many times as I wanted. So, so I came back and I started kind of looking at it and thinking about, how I wanted to change it. Started like, giving myself feedback basically. And this is a really good thing to do is, give yourself honest and, like clear feedback. There's things in this, that I really didn't like. I didn't like the render all that much. The eyes obviously were a problem. There was an intersection with a branch with a head there. The clothing on her was looking a little bit uninspiring. The storyline of her hair being cut wasn't very clear. So I went away, I carried on working on it for, just for a little bit longer, just doing all these little tweaks, very much thinking about the final image. So the next slide is the final image. First time I'm showing it anywhere. I haven't posted it, anything like that. And this is what I ended up with. Very much just a ZBrush render, very minimal comping in Photoshop. A little close up there on some of the detail. You can see I did, a little bit more obvious cuts in the back of the hair there, replaced the eyes, got rid of that intersection on the head there and things like that. It's by no means, production level asset. We will go into a lot more detail for a production level at somewhere like Axis. It's, it is a fast sculpt, so there's rough edges here and there, and there's things that could be improved. But a lot of work I do nowadays is pitch work as well. I'm working with a company that's pitching on a lot of things, so outside of my other work. So sometimes we need an image to sell something or sell our participation in something. So something like this would enable us to go around to clients and say, this is what we intend. This is the kind of thing that we're trying to do. So a quick word, on how do we get better? Practice, obviously. Years and years of practice kind of goes into a lot of things that you see people have done. I only got better at heads, when I really focused in on it, really practiced on the work I was doing. Personal projects are great for that, obviously. What I would say is do what you want rather than what you think everyone wants to see. You need to be enthusiastic about what you're working on. You need to be excited about work that you're doing, I think. Learn from others, be curious, ask questions, especially if you're in a studio or something like that. If you started somewhere, ask people how they did, you see something really cool that someone's done, ask them how they did it. If they're a nice person, if they will have been in that situation themselves, they'll be happy to share the knowledge, and they should be happy to share the knowledge. Study anatomy. And then once you're done, study anatomy some more. It's the most important thing in character modeling, and it's the biggest piece of advice I give to everyone, all the time. Keep on top of new techniques, obviously. There's always things that can make you faster, more efficient. Look for inspiration everywhere. So this is like, you go to a museum, just look at inspiration. You're just out for a walk, just, keep looking, look at the world around you. There's so many interesting, exciting things going on in whole different, spheres of creativity that you can take on board. And request feedback. And I mean feedback from people that you trust and have a good eye for this kind of thing. I can ask my dad for feedback, but it's not going to be great. It's going to be very biased as well. But ask people, and it should be good feedback. It should be constructive feedback. If someone comes back to you and says this is rubbish, that's not good feedback. What they should be coming to you and saying is like, you can improve this in these ways. Always think about constructive feedback. And learn to take that feedback well as well, because we've all done it. Someone gives you a bit of feedback. My partner sometimes gives me feedback, and it's harder coming from her than it is from anyone else for some reason. But she'll say something, and I'll be like, there's the temptation to sulk, sometimes, and you go away and you'll sulk for a little bit, and then the amount of times that, especially when I was younger, I would get feedback, I would sulk about it, and then I would do it, and then I would look at it, and I'd go, yeah, they were right. They were right. It's better now. So that's pretty much my presentation. I think we're slightly out of time. There is this QR code here. If you're a kind of person who likes to win things, then scan this QR code in here, and you can win a year of a Maxon 1 license. So well worth doing. Yeah, and thank you very much. Thank you for coming and listening to me, and hope you enjoy the rest of FMX. I think we've got a couple of minutes for questions, have we? Yeah, if anyone's got any questions, then I can answer any questions anyone's got. Any questions? You good?
Do you
Yeah.
ever go into grooms, like fiber mesh and stuff like that?
I don't go into fiber mesh myself. I don't use it that much. I generally tend to kind of model hair. Even if I'm at Axis, we would quite often, have to model some kind of hair, just at least so we've got an idea of the volume of it. But then we had a specialist groom team, to actually do grooming in Houdini. So that was where all the groom did. And then obviously for stylized work, things like Riot and things like that, you're always modeling hair. So yeah.
Thank you.
So I want it.
Are you going to be around like the next couple of days? So
I'm around all week. Yeah, so if anyone wants to ask me questions or anything like that, I will be around all week. I am slightly sleep deprived at the moment, but I actually didn't sleep over the weekend, which is like a very adult thing for me to do. But yeah, I'm going to be around all week. So if you want to ask me, questions otherwise, then just come and catch me. I'm going to be at talks and things like that, and enjoying everything that's happening here. I'm really excited to be at FMX. So yeah, just come and find me. Yep. Sorry.
How much time did you invest until the scope was the red picture?
This one, it's difficult to put a time on it because I was literally kind of, working an 8-hour day and then just doing this, as and when I could. But it's probably in total 3 or 4 days, something like that. Yeah. But that's kind of a point. There's bits in this. If you hide that sculpt, it will look really, really mucky, or if you zoom into it, it won't look great. But that's kind of a point of it. If we were doing a production model, you spend a lot longer, like really focusing on the details, trying to get the details as good as possible. The models that we had at Axis, that I worked on, that others worked on, they were about 30 days of work, including surfacing. So they really had a lot of time, spent on the details, because they're going to be, all those details are going to be seen from multiple angles, multiple distances. They're going to stretch and all sorts and things like that. So you really do have to put time into that. This kind of sculpt is for a different purpose, so there are shortcuts, taken in this. So, yeah.
Do you have the feeling that you're done with it because it doesn't look super, super detailed? So do you look at it and be like, it's 90%, I'm fine?
Yeah, it's when I feel like I've got across what I need to get across, because you can, like, obviously I could take this and I could spend another 5 days detailing easily. You could spend all that time detailing, but it's not going to. Usually in a professional environment, it's deadlines that will tell you when to stop. For myself, if I'm sculpting something, it's when I feel like I've done what I intended to do and communicated what I intended to communicate. And I think if I'm getting to a point where I'm really focusing on details, and it's a different thing that I'm trying to do. I'm trying to do like a really finished sculpt, which was not my intention here. My intention was to, get an idea across about, a story and things like that, and just do like an interesting, fast sculpt. So it is a skill in itself, knowing when to finish and when to know, that's enough. I've done enough there, and I can move on. And I think that comes with experience, certainly. Anyone can come along, obviously, and look at that and say, you should have spent more time on this, and you should have spent more time on that. That's fine. That's their opinion, and we're allowed to do that. But for me, for what I intended to do for this, the detail in there was enough to convey what I needed to. If you look at the roots close up, you can see polygons. You can see them quite clearly. But I've got the shapes in there, and I've got the kind of feeling that I wanted. So that was kind of where I stopped. Yeah. I hope that answers the question. It's a little bit of a vague question, but yeah. Sorry, yeah.
How do you transition from concept sculpt to production ready sculpt? Do you sculpt everything from you if you have the idea, or?
It really depends on the concept sculpt, because sometimes like concept sculpts you can kind of like repose it back into like a neutral pose a little bit, and then try and work from there. And then sometimes, we did intentionally at Axis, sometimes we did concept sculpts in an A pose so that we could, continue it. But the work I'm doing now, for instance, everything's posed, and in some cases, like the quite extreme poses. So, because the client will say like, we want him crouching and pointing over here, and you can't do anything about that. So, when your production models for those will probably start from scratch in some ways, or taking bits that we can and things like that. And then obviously the first thing is always kind of, you're in an A pose, re-establishing some forms, some volumes, topology, and all that kind of stuff, and getting into that grind. But yeah, it's definitely, it can be a bit of a time sink sometimes, but it's an important part of a creative process, I think, to kind of establish the character. And you got to remember as well that very often you're selling characters to people who who are not CG artists, and we'll look at a character posed like this, and we'll go, I don't like it. We always want to see a character in a pose, and that's how we get the feeling of a character. Even if it's just like quite a casual pose, it makes all the difference when you're selling it to execs and things like that, and saying this is the character we want for this. If he's in a pose, they'll buy into it. If he's in an A pose, they'll say it looks a bit stiff and a little bit awkward, and we don't really like it. So it's the nature of the job. Yeah. Yeah, one more. I've gotten quite good over the years of finding joy in anything that I can. You have to think, it's a mindset thing. You have to think about a particular angle. There might be a project that I'm just not into. It might happen in the past at Axis, at other places. A project comes along that I'm just really not into, and I don't want to name names, but sometimes you just kind of do something and you think like, I don't like the product, I don't like the characters, but I've still got to do this. I've still got to. Some of it is personal pride. You want to do the best thing that you possibly can do. The other thing is just looking for like, how can I use this to learn something? How can I use this to expand my own skills in some way? And I think that's why I started to kind of really focus on is if it's something that I don't enjoy creatively, as I start to look at how I can use it as a stepping stone to like learn something new, learn a new process, anything like that gets me enthusiastic about it. It is, there's a degree of professionalism that kind of comes into it as well. You are essentially, creating other people's visions a lot of the time, so you just have to, buckle down and get on with it. Remember, it is a job, and you've got rent, mortgage, and things like that to pay, and you want to do the best job that you can, professionally and for everyone around you as well. Because that's the even important thing. If you phone it in and you do a crappy job, someone's going to pick it up somewhere. Someone's going to have to pick that up and make it better. So yeah, personal pride and working in a team and all those kind of things, I think is really important as well. I think we're probably out of time, are we now? Or? Yeah. Okay, cool. I think we're going to have to leave it there because it's the end of the hour. Thank you so much for coming. If you want to ask me any more questions, just come in and find me, and we'll catch up later. Thanks very much.